Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, particularly after the late evening that I'm sure many of you have had. And after that introduction, I feel a wee bit overwhelmed. I'm in the presence of greatness here. But before we get started, this morning we're in the midst of a load of supply chain leaders. These are leaders from some of the largest companies in Europe, if not the world. And we're sitting here. You have interviewed some very important people in supply chain, including some of the people in this room. But today I'm interviewing you. How does it feel to be in the hot seat?
Weird. I've got to say, it feels very strange. Usually I'm the person that's interviewing people, and I'm the person that gets to probe and ask. Radu was saying, we were joking about it before, this is going to be Maria Villablanca uncut, raw. You're going to find out all the trade secrets. No, I'm just kidding. I hope it'll be interesting for you. But yeah, it feels very cool. I'm actually in a privileged position because I get to interview some of the leading minds in supply chain across multiple geographies, industries, and I get to string along all of those interviews coupled with the events that we run, the research that we do, and try to view supply chain through the prism of business value. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably where I add value to the industry, in that I'm not a supply chain practitioner. I'm a business person. I'm an entrepreneur. I am someone that has built businesses, sold businesses, succeeded in business, failed in business. And so all of those things allow me to look at supply chain through the prism of business value. And going back to, and I'm sure we'll speak about this.
Absolutely, yes.
Going back to Radu's session even, I like to connect the dots between how we view supply chain in the business world.
Okay, that's excellent. That's something we're going to explore in a lot more detail. How do we get supply chain language into business language? But before we go into that, and I hope I can interview as well as you now, but before we get into that, you've been involved in supply chains now for over 25 years, the introduction that Carrie gave us. So tell me how that started, and what do you think have been some of the major changes you've seen over the last 25 years?
Well, you know, it's funny. So first of all, last night I was at dinner, and I was talking to people, and someone asked me, so how did you get started in supply chain? I thought, whoa, I can't give this stuff away. This is stuff that's happening in the interview. You know, you're gonna have to wait and see. So a lot of people don't know this. After I left university, I ended up going to live in Chile, which is where I was born, and raised in the United States. Anyway, I went to Chile, and I started working in the food manufacturing sector. I was in charge of a joint venture between a California winery and a Chilean winery, and although my background is business and I operated in the business sphere, I was pretty much the person on the ground doing procurement, sourcing, everything from vinification to the agriculture part of things, to purchasing bottles, to purchasing, you know, doing bills of lading, the export, the import, everything. So it gave me a really good opportunity to see supply chain and manufacturing on the ground for about 5 years. Yes, I was the business person, so I could tie it all together up here. And I was really fortunate in the fact that my bosses at the time realized that I was very young, so they supported me with a load of really good mentors on top to teach me how to string all of these things together and make it work in the food manufacturing sector.
Okay, very good. So I think we were talking before about this, and you said about supply chain now is becoming a wee bit more prime time. The neighbour test you talked about. Would you like to expand upon that?
Well, you know, you asked that question about how has supply chain changed in the last 25 years. To me, there's two big things. I remember being the only woman in the room at supply chain conferences, and that was a bit, you know, weird and daunting. But now I look around and I see lots of women, lots of people of different colors and shapes and sizes and whatever, so I think that's great. The second thing is that supply chain has gone mainstream. Supply chain has always been important, but I think the rest of the world through the pandemic has caught on that it is important. And so I call it my neighbor test, which is back when I was working in supply chain, my neighbors would ask me, you know, what do you do, Maria? And I would say supply chain, and eyes would glaze over and look at me like, whatever, I don't know what that is. Whereas now, my neighbors will come up to me and say, gosh, you know what, there were no tomatoes in the supermarket. What the hell is going on there? Or I ordered this car and they're telling me it's gonna take 5 months to get it. You know, are there supply chain issues? So I think people are understanding supply chain these days. And that's a big thing. It's mainstream, which means effectively that a strong supply chain is the business. It's not the other way around.
No, it's
a strong supply chain is the business.
No, I agree. I think in Ireland we find when it gets talked about in the pub, you know that it's gone mainstream, and we're talking supply chain in the pub. And even as I said to you, my mother knows finally what I do for a business. She used to just say Geraldine's in business. Now she can say Geraldine's in supply chains. So, okay, so supply chain has gone mainstream, but are we ready for this prime time? Because the language of supply chain, and this was talked about in one of your podcasts, and I think Radu and Nut touched on this yesterday, but there was a discussion about a senior supply chain leader that you interviewed that during the pandemic started to get invited to board meetings. But when he arrived at the board meeting, he used all of the language and the jargon that we're used to using in supply chain. He used the, on time in full, the demurrage, all of those terms that we use, and their eyes glazed over and they stopped inviting him to the meetings. So we need to start to work on this language. So what advice would you give to the audience here about translating the language of supply chain into C-suite business language?
I think it's important, first of all, to understand that the people you're talking to don't know the acronyms, first of all. I think it's important to understand that the value add of supply chain is huge. It's significant for a business. Going back to my previous statement, a strong supply chain effectively is the business. And so the one thing I would recommend would be to know your CFO. First of all, to really get to know your finance director or head of finance, understand what are the business objectives and business goals of your business, of your senior leadership team, and find out how your own department, how your own teams can help solve those issues. So I think to me, supply chain is at having a moment, and it's our opportunity to seize that moment, I think, and step out of one's echo chamber of, I get it. It's a very big rat race. It's sort of like this little hamster circle that people are on all the time to try to, solve problems. And you have to step outside of that and look at how you add business value and know that. It's almost as though the supply chain leader has to be a geopolitician, an economist, a weather expert, a climate expert, a tech expert, all of those things. But think of the possibilities of the influence that supply chain has on the world.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying that we need to almost get out of our own silos. And that's quite interesting because as supply chain practitioners, what we're trying to say to the whole business is you can't operate in a silo. You need to think of all the different functions, and also you need to think outside of the four walls.
Yeah.
But you're saying that we're guilty of that ourselves.
Yes.
Yes. How do we stop that? How do we?
Well, one of the things I try to operate on the basis is that the people that I'm speaking with don't understand the nitty-gritty, the ins and outs of supply chain. And so to talk in tech terms, to talk in acronyms, you're going to lose people. It's kind of like people who understand American football. You're going to lose the rest of the world when you try to explain it to them. You know what I mean? It's not the best way to communicate. You have to find a common ground. And common language. And again, Radu's session was fantastic. I got a great massage, so that's a plus. But on top of that, he is absolutely right. It's about communication and language.
So it's getting that common language. And you say, know your CFO. So talk to CFO language, talk the numbers.
Yes.
Get the returns. Okay. All right, let's move on to talking a wee bit about perhaps the future proofing of supply chains. And Pawan spoke yesterday a lot about mega trends, and he talked about the trends that we've been experiencing. And at the minute, when I think about supply chains, I think of that ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And we are living in interesting times.
That's an understatement.
We're still trying to recover from COVID. We've conflicts in Europe, there's tensions in APAC, there's dramatically rising cost of living. I think it was clocked last week in the UK at 10.4%, which is just shocking. And you only have to look at the queues in Dover last week to see that Brexit protocol, Windsor framework, whatever it's been called now, is still having an impact. So all of these have factors in supply chains. This is what they're talking about in the pubs in Ireland. But that means we need to adapt our supply chain. So, but how do we plan for the unpredictable? Who could have predicted all of that? How can we future-proof our supply chains?
You can't plan for the unpredictable. I mean, let's start off on the basis. We couldn't predict COVID, we couldn't predict, that's why they're called black swan events, right? So they're events that we can't predict. The unfortunate situation is that over the last couple of years, we've not just had one black swan event, it seems as we've had a flock of black swan events happening at us. So one of the things that I learned in the many conversations is the actual scenario and situation doesn't matter. Is it COVID, is it war, is it supply or demand, or what I wrote a newsletter called the cocktail of crisis. Okay. We are facing a cocktail of crisis, an economic crisis, a climate crisis, a skills shortage crisis, a supply crisis, a demand crisis. I mean, you name it. Think of anything bar, like we talked about, alien invasions or whatever, and who knows, who has that on the bingo card. But the point is that there's a lot happening, but that doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that your business is adaptive or can adapt to whatever this X is. That X, that black swan, doesn't matter what it is. You just have to work on the basis of your supply chain being able to adapt to that. Mm-hmm. And so to a scenario, a supply shortage, a demand shortage. If you focus less on the what, and focus more on the, it's just gonna stop this one issue or two or three or whatever, and then move down the line. For me, I think one of the key things is investment in digital transformation.
Okay.
I think that is, it's not a question of if, it's a question of must. Organizations that are not, and I'm sure we'll talk later about maturity stages for digital transformation, but organizations that are on the early stage of digital transformation have less of a chance of being able to be resilient against the what ifs, whatever is happening out there.
And now I hate to do this to use a football analogy or a game, but we're talking offensive and defensive strategies here for supply chain. So it's about being resilient and about being agile.
Yes.
Isn't that where you're going with this? So we need to think of it in both ways?
Yeah, absolutely. We do need to think about it in both ways. It can't just be, and you know what I really hate? The resilience buzzword. You know what I mean? It's now becoming a sort of like everyone's talking about resilience. Okay, how do we operationalize that? How do we actually build resilience into an organization? How do we actually create the operational functions and merge technology with processes, with culture to create the right type of adaptable atmosphere to work in?
Okay. Well, now you said earlier that there's high demands of supply chain leaders these days, that they need to be tech people, they need to be politicians, they need to be business people, they need to understand the economy. Now, I'm just going to move us on a wee bit that obviously when you're trying to understand and do all of those, you need advice. And a company that a lot of the people in this room would turn to for advice is Gartner. Now, Gartner talks a lot about this maturity model that you alluded to there, and many of the members of our audience, I'm sure, are trying to get to the stage 4, stage 5 maturity model. Pawan yesterday spoke about ecosystems, and I know that the underlying strategic assumption for the Gartner maturity model is that 50% of companies will be competing by 2026. They'll be competing as ecosystems. They won't be competing as discrete companies. So as a newly appointed Gartner peer ambassador, I believe, do you agree with that statement, and how would you build upon that?
Yes, I very much agree with that statement. We did our own research in my organization. We interviewed about 256 people, I think 257 people out of 162 companies worldwide. They're companies over several billions of dollars, VP level executives or above, and asked them about digital transformation and their maturity stage. And what we also identified is that at the moment and by the way, this group is, I would say, about 46% European, 38%, 40% US. And generally speaking, we found that 2/3 of these companies were in the early stages of maturity. Several areas of the early stages, some of them really early, some of them in the middle.
So you're talking stages 1, 2, and
3.
3.
Exactly.
Okay.
They were in their stages 1, 2, and 3. But there's this great divide between those in 1, 2, and 3 and those in 4, 5, 6. Very few are in 6. Most of them are in 4 of the 1/3. But what we did find is that those organizations that sit in the later stages of maturity are more agile. They're more resilient. They're more able to handle any kind of crisis. They attract top talent. They keep top talent. They have strong leadership. So they have all of these excellent things, which goes back to my earlier point. It is not a question of if, it's a question of you will not be able to weather whatever is coming our way without investment in digital transformation.
And do you think using the language of Gartner or the supply chain maturity model, will that move to the C-suite? Can we use it there? Is that understandable at that level? Or not?
Yes. I mean, I don't know if the CEO is interested in whether or not we're an ecosystem or a chain, but the reality is that ecosystem businesses are going to be much more effective. And that's the overall problem I have with the word supply chain. We're not just this linear chain, this completely solid linear chain. This is an ecosystem already. It's a living, breathing ecosystem that's complex with suppliers, multiple tiers of suppliers. It changes, it adapts. And I think that companies need to embrace that ecosystem mentality to be able to deal better with what's coming ahead and collaborate as well.
Absolutely. I think we're going to come back on the word collaboration, but it's getting outside those four walls. But still on Gartner, if we're still moving there at stage 4, stage 5, and it's not easy, as you say, there's a leap to get there. And in one of your recent podcasts, you were talking about companies that want to make that leap to stage 4 and stage 5, they need to display a touch of daring. What do you mean by that?
A touch of daring. So again, in the research, we found that companies were limiting themselves or were limited by two big things: the lack of skills to carry out digital transformation, and also legacy systems that were either too complex or too convoluted. My thinking is that they need to challenge the norm. Okay. Companies and leaders need to unlearn a lot of things that were being used 20 years ago, 10 years ago. It means, again, getting outside of the echo chamber. It means connecting the dot with business value and really being uncomfortable in these situations, innovating. And it's important that organizations focus on innovation as well as the day-to-day things that they need to do. So daring to me is daring to be different, not for the sake of difference, but for the sake of, I'm not going to do this just because it's always been done this way.
Well, give me an example of something that they might need to unlearn.
Well, the first one that comes to mind is diverse critical thinkers. The future of technology is here. Yeah, so AI, machine learning, all of that stuff is very much in its infancy, but it's arrived. And so the questions I get asked all the time is, Maria, what kind of skills do you think leaders need in the future? And my answer is diverse critical thinking. Yes, understanding technology, yes, understanding geopolitics, economics, etc. But I think surrounding yourself with people that are diverse, not for the sake of diversity. I'm not talking about quotas and ticking boxes. Okay, I've got one person of this color and one person of that gender. It's not about that. It's about that plus thinking differently. So, hiring people from creative industries, hiring people from startup industries, really surrounding yourself and fostering the kind of environment within your organization that allows people to fail, but fail fast, fail quickly, and that has that flexibility to bring in creative thinkers.
And when we're bringing young people now into supply chain, obviously there's lots of supply chain courses in universities, etc. Are you finding that they're giving the right education to them, that they're giving them the right grounding? We need to develop them in supply chain?
I think a lot of institutions are trying. They are trying. But I think it's also down to the leadership and businesses to actually demand that they want people that are critical thinkers, give them problems. We're not going to solve these weird problems that we've been having, this flock of swans in this cocktail of crisis, by doing the exact same thing that we did 20 years ago or 50 years ago. A lot of the business lessons I learned were from textbooks from the 70s. No disrespect to the 70s, but it was, that was a long time ago, right? So today's world is pretty different. So we're going to need people that can think to challenge you. And I get challenged all the time. I surround myself with a team of really diverse thinkers who, they drive me crazy sometimes because I come from a generation of you do this because your boss tells you to do this and that's how you do this. But they ask me why. Why are we doing this? And I think, well, my first instinct is to go because I friggin' said so. But then I shut it down and I think, okay, because of this is what I was thinking, and okay, but can't we try this other thing? And sometimes, you know what? There's something interesting there.
Absolutely. Well, I was sitting at the table last night with some of the Accenture folks. I can't see where they are at the minute, but we had an interesting conversation about focus and about how you can get this focus to solve these complex problems, to do the critical thinking. And I was telling them about a book that I had got about a year ago by an author called Johan Hari, who's a journalist in the UK. And he'd written this book about losing focus. And he's saying that we're losing the ability to focus on these complex problems because we flit around too much.
Yeah.
You know, social media distractions, all this. We don't think enough. We don't spend this time critical thinking. The sad thing I had to admit to last night was I didn't actually finish the book, so so that wasn't particularly good. But so it's not just the young people today. I think it's our generation as well. How do we get that better focus? Because if we're going to solve these complex problems, we're going to have to focus on them. Do you have any advice for how we build that into our working lives?
Yeah, I would say it is a question of working at it. You know, it's kind of like balance, right? That's something we can learn from the younger generation, this work-life balance.
That's true.
Right? I mean, we're sort of like work until you die at your desk, right? That's kind of a little bit how my dad's generation, our generation taught us that. Stay at the same company for
40 years in the same job.
You know
they
what I mean?
don't move, yes.
So I think one of the things, you have to be purposeful to work at innovation.
Okay.
So structure it. Put time in your calendar. If you're in a big enough company, set up a small team to prototype different types of activities. Be mindful of innovation. I take purposefully 2 hours a week where I just unplug. I call it going into my bunker. And I'm like, please don't contact me unless the building's on fire. And I just either take my dogs for a walk or do something completely different. But the idea is to focus on what ifs. What could I do better? What is needed in this world? What is something that serves others, serves my employees, serves my shareholders, serves my company, serves my clients, right? And try to focus on innovation, which is why a lot of my great ideas come when I'm walking the dogs or in the shower or shopping or doing something completely different. So you have to be mindful and purposeful.
Okay. Yeah, I notice a lot of my team, they'll book out focus time, and I know e2open has had an initiative for at least a year or more now where no internal meetings on a Friday afternoon to give people that chance to do a wee bit more critical thinking and planning for the week ahead. Okay, moving on from there. Transforming supply chains is a big part of what you talk about in your podcasts and your newsletters. It's the theme, it's always a theme. Now, with any transformational project though, timing is critical. And we all know loads of projects that have failed because the company or the people weren't ready for that change. But what foundation do you think companies need to have in place before they start on a big transformation to stage 4, stage 5? What are the critical things they need to be doing already?
Well, I think, first of all, it's to ask yourself the question, what problem am I trying to solve here? As opposed to transformation for the sake of transformation. I once had dinner with someone who was saying to me, oh, my CEO was just on my case about building robotics into the business, and he was so intent on robotics, that we spent like $1 million on robotics. And I said, well, what does it do? It must be really exciting. He said, yeah, it moves packages from here to there. And I said, that's it. You spent $1 million to move packages from here to there. And he said, well, at least the CEO's happy because now we have robotics. So transformation...
More than that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Transformation for the sake of transformation is wrong.
Okay.
Is this going to solve a problem for my clients? Is this going to solve a problem for my employees? Is it going to make their work easier? Is it going to solve a problem for my shareholders? What problem am I trying to solve here? I think that's one of the things. And I think it's got to be also how much time, staff, investment do I need to allocate to transformation as well? Because I think a lot of times people underestimate that. It's kind of like when you renovate your house. You know, oh yes, I'm going to spend $30,000, and you end up spending $100 because you did not foresee all the other crap that you had to realize and do. So it's the same concept here. Dedicate a real thorough understanding is what you're trying to do.
But do you think they need to be at a certain stage from a technology perspective or others, or processes before they should even think of stage 4, stage 5 in the maturity model?
I've interviewed people in different areas. I've interviewed people that have just jumped straight into a moonshot type of example and sort of changed their entire business operating model, and I've interviewed people that have prototyped little bits at a time. I think it's important to understand that supply chain, and I think you alluded to that when we were talking about this, why is supply chain transformation important right now? Because, and this is what I talk about a lot, my podcast is called Transform Talks, and it started out because I was having really cool conversations with people about digital transformation, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to be like a fly on the wall and have people listen to these conversations? And it goes even further back. About 10, 13 years ago, I was in a conference sitting around with some of the biggest names in manufacturing and supply chain, chief this, chief that. And we talked about digital transformation. And the look that I got on people's faces were like, yeah, I don't know where I'm gonna start. I don't know how I'm gonna do this. And I thought, holy crap, these are the best people in the world. And if they don't know what's going on, what is the hope for other people?
Okay.
So I started to delve deeper into why transformations fail. How do you bring about successful transformation? And of course, it's the perfect convergence of people, processes, and technology.
Yeah.
I would add to that purpose as well. It's an important thing. Why am I doing this? Is it going to better the world or my clients, et cetera? And so we then started to evolve this Transform Talks podcast away just from really cool transformations of supply chain and more into every aspect of transformation. We have to transform business models, operating models, think of supply chain as an ecosystem, transform the way we hire, transform the way we network, really we are at the next stage or the next iteration of business transformation, the industrial revolution, whatever you want to call it, we are on the cutting edge of that.
As I said earlier, we're living in exciting, interesting times.
Yes.
But let's talk about resistance to change, because when you're talking transformational projects in supply chain, we're not now just in the four walls of what you can control in your company. You need to be transforming how you're working with your partners, with your suppliers, with your channel partners. Give us a wee bit of advice on how we get over the natural resistance to change, particularly outside the four walls of your organization.
You know, that was a really interesting slide in Pawan's presentation yesterday that I thought was when he put that supply chain up there and said that the majority of change, you know, crisis and unknown and uncertainty doesn't come from within your four walls. It comes from outside of things you can't control, right? So I think when you're going to do a transformation project, first of all, the people around you, whether they're your suppliers or employees, they're not stupid. Talk to them, bring them with you. And then again goes back to language, and again goes back to what I've been saying for a while. I think supply chain people in general, because we're so busy looking at our own acronyms inside our own little box, inside the silo, and we're not naturally very good storytellers. Right? And so I think we need to get outside of that and realize, and this is a conversation I was having, I might deviate and go off topic here for a second, but I was talking at dinner last night. There was this young lady sitting next to us, very young girl who had just started to get into supply chain. We were talking about supply chain, and I thought, we do a really bad job in this industry to talk about how exciting supply chain is, how fundamentally transformational to the world supply chain is. Supply chain is business. And I think we have to make sure that we recognize the value that supply chain brings. And that's a beautiful story. That's a fantastic story. It was being done even, if you think about it, even before COVID with disruptors like the Dollar Shaving Club. That you know the story. They were bought out by, this is a company that started selling subscription razors, right?
Ah, right.
Okay, and so they started selling subscriptions, which is a great model. Then they scaled in a huge way and were able to adapt their supply chains and create a really strong supply chain, really great customer loyalty. And this tiny little startup run up by these two guys sold to Unilever for $1 billion. Amazon was doing that as well, which is a strong supply chain equals a strong business. So we need to explore the narrative that supply chain is sexy. Supply chain is innovative. Supply chain is where the technology is. Think about how much GDP is spent on manufacturing and supply chain.
Absolutely.
Who the world's biggest polluters are, supply chain and manufacturing. So there's an opportunity to change the world in supply chain.
Well, I think we saw that during COVID, though, as well. Like, I mean, okay, we needed to keep the key workers going, the nurses, the doctors, all that, but out there it was, how do we keep the supply chains flowing? You know, I must admit at that time, and I'm sure everybody in this room did as well, you felt as though you were some part of something really important. You had to help keep the world turning. Okay, let's move on. I mean, I do agree completely with what you're saying about what problem are we solving. And I know anytime we have conversations with senior execs, either in our company or what, it's like, what problem are we solving for you? What value are we adding? But let's change a wee bit of direction here, if you don't mind. I'd like to move on to talking about sustainability, and in this case, a company and an individual that I've always admired. A large company that I think has shown this touch of daring that you talked about earlier. Now, you mentioned them yourself earlier, you mentioned Unilever. Now, I've always been a fan of Paul Polman. Paul Polman was their CEO from 2009 to 2019. And he worked and did a lot of change in the company around sustainability, and not just about how they interact with the environment, but about social governance and their social impact, and he delivered good returns. But he did this thing, he planted this seed of sustainability where everybody owned it. It wasn't just owned by him, it was owned right throughout the company. Now, you've got a room full of very important supply chain leaders here. What advice would you give them to go back to how can they get that seed of sustainability or nurture that seed across their companies?
Before I answer that, I'm going to say something else, which is we are living in an era today where companies that are saying one thing and doing another are getting caught out. So it is, even if you don't believe in sustainability, even if you don't think that it's something that, because I'm busy running my business, I don't have time for sustainability. This is something, I'll give an example. So International Women's Day, which happened a little while ago, and there's this chatbot in the UK. You know what a chatbot, right? So it's tech, it's an actual robot, right? It's a chatbot. This chatbot on Twitter, every time a UK-based business tweeted, "Happy International Women's Day," it reacted immediately and called them out based on data that is filed with the UK government, and it would expose them on their gender pay equity gap. Okay? Now, it was quite funny, but at the same time, scary as hell, because if we live in the kind of time where companies gloss over certain performance metrics or certain sort of big statements like sustainability or diversity, equity, inclusion, they're going to be caught out. Mm-hmm. So how do you take people with you? So that was the first part, is you're gonna have to. If you don't believe ESG and sustainability and all these things are important, trust me, something's coming for you, and it isn't people, it's the robots. They're going to expose any kind of greenwashing or whatever washing you do. So it's imperative that it's done.
Okay.
Now, so
no
how
place
do you,
to hide.
No place to hide. So how do you implement, or you take people with them with the narrative? You remunerate them based on results. I interviewed, or I was on a panel with the Tesco chief procurement officer, and he said that his remuneration and that of his team is directly tied to sustainability goals.
Okay.
So, I'd ask the question here in this room, how many of you have got bonuses or remuneration that is tied to sustainability goals in your business?
Hands up.
Yeah,
how many you've got?
Literally 1, 2. Right. How are we going to change if that doesn't change? So I think you need to get leadership to really invest in this and say, okay, if we're going to take this seriously, well, guess what? Your bonus is tied to that. Your bonus is tied to that.
Indeed. Well, very good. Well, can I ask, where are Smurfit Kappa? Guys, where's Smurfit Kappa in there? Okay, thank you. Yesterday when I was in a meeting with Smurfit Kappa, and we're talking about sustainability, and one of the things that they led with was telling me that of the packaging materials that they make, 80% of them are recyclable and 20% come from sustainable sources. And I remember being very impressed that that was how the conversation was led in the room. It was ownership of sustainability at every level in the supply chain. So hey, take a bow. That's excellent. Okay, so that seed of sustainability, it is super important, and it is becoming more and more important. But let me expand this out a wee bit beyond to all of ESG. Now, Michael Farlekas yesterday talked a lot about the risks in a company and the different types of risks that you've got. And this includes good governance and who you choose to do business with. And once again, we're not just inside, it's your immediate collaborative partners. We help in e2open, we help our customers take a look in multiple tiers of the supply chain, who they're doing business with. Do you think supply chain leaders are doing enough looking down the multi-tiers of their supply chain and assessing risk?
No.
No?
Really, you rarely will hear me give a one-word answer.
How do we get them to do more?
You know, I have a funny anecdote here. Does everybody here, I'm sure you know Professor David Simchi-Levy from MIT, right? I do a lot of work with David. And we were doing a webinar together once about the start of the pandemic. And he said, Maria, I'd like to do a poll before we do the webinar to ask people how many of you have mapped your supply chain down to the second and third tiers.
Okay.
And me and my infinite wisdom decide to talk to the director of the data sciences lab, and I go, David, isn't that a bit of a simplistic question?
Yeah.
Of course. And he says, no, trust me, Maria, people have not done that. And I said, David, come on. I'm sure people have done that. I mean, this is, we're not talking to low-level people. This is senior-level supply chain leaders. He said, Maria, will you trust me and just put the question in? So I said, fine, we'll put the question in. I was blown away and shocked that out of the 100 and odd people that were there, 90% of them had not done it.
Wow.
And this is at the start of the pandemic, and I thought the huge risk that is sitting there in terms of not being able to map the supply chain and understand where the next big issue is going to come was just mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing.
And we talked earlier about knowing your CFOs. CFOs are the risk officers in the company. I think Michael Farlekas was saying that yesterday too. This is a language they'll understand if we're looking to
100% right. I interviewed a CFO from a big pharma company, and I said to him, look, no disrespect, but you're Mr. No. That's the way everyone sees you. You're Mr. No. Everybody comes to you with, I've got this new project, I want to invest in this new technology, I want to hire here or do whatever, and you usually are the person that says no. Mm-hmm. How do you get supply chain leaders to get their projects approved? How can they convince you? And his answer was, what people don't realize is that I am not just CFO, but generally speaking, I'm also in charge of risk. So if you talk to me in the terms of risk, what is the risk of not doing something or the risk of doing something? And you quantify that some way and give some sort of example. Like, for example, the risk of not doing enough for sustainability is ginormous. I will always invest in that.
We had a very interesting conversation just last week with the CIO of one of our customers, who'll have to remain nameless because I don't have permission to share the details of this out, but they had just invested on some restricted party screening solutions and lists with us, and they'd only implemented them a few weeks, and they'd already identified about 3 tiers down in their companies that they shouldn't be doing business with, and they were busy boasting that they had saved the company 7-figure fines by finding that. So there's a language there we can use and explore further. Maria, still on the subject of ESG, want to talk, the European Union has recently adopted some new trade policies around forced labour in the supply chain. Would you like to talk a wee bit about the impact of that on business and how we can get compliance with it?
I mean, we talked about how technology is coming to really highlight those companies that aren't doing enough. There's also the government. Government is passing legislation that is going to ensure that companies build transparency within their supply chains. And that goes back to the David Simchi-Levy example. If you don't build transparency, if you don't look at your entire ecosystem, I don't want to use the word chain, ecosystem, and expose risk, you're not going to be able to adapt to change. You're not going to be agile. You're not going to be resilient. And worst of all, you risk failure. You risk failure, and you risk becoming a dinosaur that is no longer relevant in this modern world.
Okay, so we're talking, this is today's problem. It's not tomorrow's problem, it's today's problem.
This is, we all have to prioritize. I prioritize, you prioritize in business. I can't do everything at once, right? So, but this is just not one of those things that you prioritize for tomorrow. This is today's problem.
Okay, all right. Going to change a wee bit from sustainability. I work for a technology company. I'd be very remiss in my duties if we didn't talk a bit about supply chain technology and impact on the pace of technology change in supply chains. So would you like to talk a wee bit, and I'd like to start perhaps with autonomous decision making and how you're seeing that within supply chain.
I think it's an absolute must. I think it's going to liberate supply chain leaders from the mundane, repetitive tasks and help us become more creative and critical thinking. I think it's an absolute must for resilience, for agility, and relevance in today's world. Your customers are going to demand it. Your employees are going to demand it. I had a conversation the other day with someone from a large Fortune 100 company, a VP level executive at maybe 35, 40-year-old, and they said that they were leaving their company because they felt that there was not enough commitment into digital transformation. And there was a lot of talk about it, but not a lot of doing. And they were going to go to a company they felt was more modern and would absolutely embrace digital transformation, autonomous supply chains, digital twins, AI, machine learning, because it was going to help solve a lot of problems.
The amount of data that we're dealing with in supply chain is enormous.
We are drowning in data.
Yeah.
There's more data coming. The more we become connected. I mean, I've never been this connected. My phone, my watch, everything is spying on me. My Alexa, we've got tons of data that is sitting in places. A lot of it is good data because it's behavioral data. It helps us understand our clients better. It helps us understand our employees better. And so we have tons of data in this world. And there is no mental capacity in the human mind to be able to dissect all that data. You need intelligence, you need machine learning and AI to be able to do that. Now, the crux of this is how do you implement that in your organization and layer it into complex processes, existing legacy systems to create the right type of environment to succeed. And that is where organizations like e2open, which is why I'm here, you guys do that very well. And you're able to really lay the groundwork that organizations need to process all of this and move on to what is hopefully going to be the next iteration of the supply chain ecosystem.
Absolutely, and you're right, it's the data right across the ecosystem once again. Now we're going to talk about ChatGPT in a moment, but I actually, in preparation for this, I was asking ChatGPT how much data they thought was in supply chains. Give me a number. What sort of data is there in supply chains? Now, I had to ask the question in about 3 different ways and 3 different answers, but the first answer I got was 42 zettabytes. Now, the first I laughed at, I thought that sounds like the answer to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, life, the universe, everything. I thought it was spoofing me. And then I had to think, what's a zettabyte? Hands up, who knows what a zettabyte is? Oh, we do have a couple of brain boxes here. Okay, for the rest of you, it's 10 to the power of 21. I had to look it up, it was enormous. But ChatGPT, it's kind of the technology subject at the minute, or it's the, and you have talked about it, I know, in your newsletters, etc., the ChatGPT. Do you think that it's been described as revolutionary? Bill Gates came out recently and said it was the second, only the second most revolutionary technology he had ever seen, the first being the graphical user interface that became the basis of Microsoft. And he's now talking about this. Do you think it's going to be revolutionary in supply chain technology?
Yes, absolutely. I did an interview, again, with Radu and Knut on my podcast, and we were joking around a little bit about ChatGPT, and Knut did he asked ChatGPT, who is Maria Villablanca, and he had to do several iterations of it to finally get the answer. And then we played around with it, and Knut asked ChatGPT to relate supply chain to Lord of the Rings and see how it would all come together, and it gave a really cool response. So it's fun to play with. I'm sure a lot of you have played with it, but let's talk about it from a practical perspective. I did an interview recently with 2 gentlemen from ION who wrote a book about, they asked ChatGPT 100 S&OP questions, 100 planning questions, and they rated each response to see how accurate it was. Now, the gist of it, without giving it away, because you should buy the book, it's a good book, but the gist of it is essentially that your jobs are safe, for now, yeah?
Good to know.
Good to know,
yes.
Your jobs, but there was a caveat there, for now.
Okay.
what it determined was that in a vacuum, if everything is equal, if everything was perfect, which we know isn't the case, that ChatGPT can answer complex planning questions. However, if you throw in a complexity such as, okay, but this is for the pharma industry or the food industry and it requires cold chain or whatever, then it didn't know how to answer. Okay, so obviously we know we live in a complex world, and we know ChatGPT can't necessarily create something out of nothing because we need human innovation for that. That's something we can do. We can be given a scenario we have never experienced in our lives and find some way to innovate. And ChatGPT can't do that yet. Eventually it will. So what does that mean for the supply chain leader? What does that mean for the planner? It's going to be an opportunity to utilize that to help make decisions. So I don't think it's that they're going to replace planners, I think, or replace supply chain leaders. I think what it's going to do is help augment the job of planning so we can better understand demand and supply. And if you think about the pace of change and the change of consumer behaviors and the bullwhip effect that we saw during the pandemic, all of those things with the use of technology like AI is going to be just a little bit simpler.
Okay, but do we need to slow down on it? I read recently that a group of tech leaders, including Elon Musk and Steve Wozniak, they've all come out and they said they would like us to stop development on super ChatGPT for 6 months and put together some rules. And Italy recently banned it. I know the Irish authorities are looking at it as well. Literally banned it. So do we need to slow down and get those rules right before we start introducing it?
Yes, I think we have no idea the power that this is going to have. It's quite scary. And I did an interview with the cybersecurity czar for the US government under President Obama, and he said that and he's right, we don't talk about security in the supply chain from a cyber perspective very much. It's that guy's problem over there, or that guy's problem over there in the IT department or the security or risk department. It's not my problem, but yet it's the most vulnerable area in the world in terms of supply chain security is quite huge. So yeah, it's a very scary moment, very scary thing, with deep fakes and everything, So yes, I would agree that we probably need to look at regulating it in some way.
Okay, but on the other hand, you talk in your podcasts and your newsletters about these digital dark ages, that there are many companies that are still in the digital dark age. So you don't want them to slow down.
No, but again, that's the maturity stages, isn't it? So I think that there are companies today that are, come on, we're all still using Excel spreadsheets. Let's be honest. There's this, this love-hate with Excel that we all seem to have. We have systems that are really good, but yet some people say, well, I just have to use my Excel. I trust it. I trust it a lot more. We have emails, data sitting in emails. We still correspond, whether it's via emails or via chat, with our team members. There's a lot of information that's sitting in these unknown data pools. And I think that companies that are not able to extract that information, process it, and use it to the benefit of the business are to some extent working in the digital dark ages. There are companies still using pen and paper. For those of you that are young in the room, that's the thing in front of you right here.
Yeah, my kids laugh at me for using email even, never mind pen and paper.
Exactly.
Yes, using email. Okay. All right, you've also talked then about redefining the supply chain. And I don't think you want to get a completely new term for it. I hope not. But my mother never understands what I do for a living, okay? But in e2open, we talk about moving as one. And I know that in a lot of your podcasts and your newsletters, you talk about supply chains on the move. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that supply chains have got to evolve. They've got to, and it's just funny that you talk about moving as one. We have to collaborate within the ecosystem of the supply chain to be able to move as one entity and adapt to the world that we're living in at the moment.
This gets us to collaboration, that
it gets
much
us to
overused
collaboration.
term.
And it also gets us to redefining the supply chain. Again, I brought up Unilever again, and I will bring it up again because if you don't know, they've recently got rid of their chief supply chain officer and all of their supply chain function. They operate as a business operations. That's how important they see supply chain, that it is no longer the supply chain back office office, cost center department over there.
This is
the
supply
business
chain.
operations.
Okay.
So that is everyone in this room that is working in supply chains. You are the business. You are the future. You are the people that are going to change the world. So you need to start talking like that in the business sense and get your seat on the board table.
And talk the language properly when you get there.
Yes,
talk the language of risk, get the numbers.
Of course.
Okay. When you do. All right. I'm going to one more question, and then I'm going to go to the audience. So start thinking of your questions, please. But one more from me, just to lay it up with, is that in a recent article, Maria, you described supply chain leaders. You described us as drunk. Okay. Now, it's not the first time I've had that accusation, but there's a whole room full of us. So while I'd say a few of us here may be suffering from hangovers, I would like to think that they're not drunk at the minute. But I think what you meant, is that we're drunk on perma-crises. We're just drunk and running from one crisis to the other. So my question is, how are we going to sober up, and how big is the hangover going to be for us?
Yes, I feel like we are on this perpetual hamster wheel of crisis management, constant crisis, issues. And I think that it's not going to slow down, right? So normal, whatever that was, is not coming back.
We're not going back.
No, that's not happening. So this is the way that we're operating now. If you don't get off that hamster wheel, you are going to, well, first of all, burn out. Which I think is a very important thing to talk about. We don't talk enough about that executive burnout and executive mental wellness, and I think that's an important thing. I've done podcasts on that as well. I think we need to get off that hamster wheel. How? By creating teams that deal with innovation, that adopting digital transformation, looking at different business operating models, collaborating with people, validating your opinions, coming to conferences, having conversations with people. We have to get off this perpetual sort of hamster wheel.
So it's not losing sight of the important while we're dealing with the urgent.
No,
That's
exactly.
We've got to focus on the important. I really have to finish that book on focus then, don't I?
You sure do.
Okay.
Or throw it out.
Or throw it out, one or other. Okay, right. I'd like to move out to the audience now and see if we've any questions for Maria.
Oh, there's one over there in the back.
So I feel very inspired listening to this chat, and look at this light, right? This glamorous stage. My question is that, how does it feel to move from the supply chain backstage to the front stage and feel this light, and then see the audience and talk about the glamour of supply chain?
That's a good question. Thank you. I think we've been oh yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Can you hear me? So the second question is, before I lose my chance, right? Second question is that we were talking about the chain model. That sounds to be the bridge to transform a supply chain expert to be a supply chain leader, business leader. So you seem to have mastered that. And could you share with us how and where did you learn this from? The chain model to become a real role model of that.
Thank you for that. Okay, so first of all, I think supply chain has gone mainstream, and we need to take advantage of the fact that it's gone mainstream and that Geraldine's mother knows what it's all about. My neighbors know what it's all about. And so we need to embrace the fact that supply chain is exciting, it is fascinating, and we need to step away from the perma-crisis to be able to explore the opportunities in supply chain. It is glamorous, and one of the things that I like to do is I like to be an advocate of the importance of supply chain. Attract talent to supply chain, attract diverse talent to supply chain. So it's important to speak up about the great innovations that are happening. So how does it feel? Amazing, awesome, I love it. But equally, I'm also stepping outside of my comfort zone. Usually I'm used to, I'm a 40-odd plus woman, and yet I'm considered an influencer, which is quite weird,
yes.
It's made me get out of my own comfort zone, and I'm Gen X, we don't take pictures of our food and post it, We're not sort of, hey, look at me, this is me on Tuesday, So we have to get outside of our comfort zone and expose or talk about the great things in supply chain. So it feels amazing to be recognized as someone that is talking about it and bringing light. And if I help convince people that it's a great profession to be in, then I've done my job. Insofar as how did I learn the model? Well, first of all, the book hadn't been written when I learned the model, so you kind of instinctive. And so the biggest teacher for me in my own personal experience has been failure. I love failure. I hate failure at the time. I don't like it at all. It feels terrible. But failure by far has been my biggest teacher. So failing at something and learning has been where I've been able to adapt to that kind of environment. Secondly, I know the value of business. I'm a commercial person. I've always been a commercial person. And I've never lost sight of the fact that the world goes round because of money and because of commerce. And so where does supply chain fit into that? And I've been able to manage that connection between those two to tell that story. I hope that answers your question.
No, thank you. And I'm loving the idea that you're thinking we're glamorous.
Yeah,
that's all I'm focusing on out of that question. Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any other questions for Maria? Okay, some of...
So, Maria, I know you haven't done the research. Maybe in one of your future podcasts you can ask, but instinctively, like you just mentioned, based on all your conversations, how many senior people do you think, or senior leaders, see sustainability and resilience still as an overlay, something which needs to be added rather as something which is fundamentally core to supply chain execution? I have my opinions based on conversations. And then the next one, how many of them still see it as distinct? Right, that you have a chief sustainability officer and a chief resilience officer potentially working across purposes. And we know what the answer should be, but I want to get your feeling what the market has today.
I think we've stopped talking about sustainability as something that we should be doing. So we've moved away from the theoretical question to we have to implement it. The problem that I find in most organizations is that they are still failing to operationalize it. So operationalizing sustainability is one of the big challenges people have. How do you actually build that deep-seated sustainability strategy into tactics? How do I get that into my organizations deep all the way down? But you do it just like you did everything else. You do it just like you implemented quality control standards, just like you implemented, with the help of regulations, with the help of collaboration and working not at cross purposes like you talked about, but working cohesively as one, empowering the chief sustainability officer, empowering the chief supply chain officer to be able to deal with this.
Yeah, but it's more, I think you do have to make it everybody's issue. It's the same as security. At the minute, I know in e2open, we've been told it's this time of year where we all have to go through our security training, which is great because it means that we all understand that security of data is everybody's issue. Sustainability needs to be everybody's issue. And I go back again to my Smurfit Kappa friends, and they brought that up in the first conversation. This is what we do as a business. And I thought that's brilliant, they're starting. So that's definitely a direction we need to go with it. Okay, thank you. Have we any final questions from the audience?
Who's going to get there first? Thank you. That was a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. I'll stick with sustainability topic for one more second. I think I do see green shoots. By the way, I'm from Shipio. I'm a partner of e2open, and we provide visibility solutions. If you Google Hakan Bulgulu of Arçelik, there's a YouTube video that he has done about how he brought about a fundamental change in Arçelik's operations about sustainability by bringing attention to that, by announcing that he was going to climb the Mount Everest and hurl the banner of sustainability from up there. And his whole organization saw him train and put his life literally on the risk. People on his team actually died on Everest. So he really literally put his life on the risk to bring it up. And now he has a moral high ground where he talks to fellow CEOs. He was talking to grocery CEOs about reducing plastic in their thing and how they use material, etc. So there are these CEOs who are actually making it their life's purpose to make a change. But he argues about a point which we feel passionate about is you can't improve what you can't measure, and one of the key requirement is data to help them understand how even the simplest activity in the supply chain contributes to scope 3 emissions, which, I mean, of course, regulations will come and have that. I mean, I think it's very important for supply chain organizations to go the route of quality control that you talked about. In the 60s and 70s, quality control was one thing you did at the end till Toyota and Japanese car makers said, no, you do quality every step of the way, and the sum total of it is what brings about. Sustainability has to be that way. Scope 1 emissions, what you do inside your building. Scope 2 emissions, what you do to get your business running. And Scope 3, which is about supply chain, which is the most polluting thing, as you pointed out. The data now exists. We can capture data as to which truck took what load to where, from where to where, and what that particular shipment's contribution to sustainability was. And then to use to the previous question about then using it to properly plan, which is where e2open does an amazing job of, needs to be part of the DNA, and linking incentives, et cetera, is great, but actually showing the data and using the data to make decisions, I think is so from your, perch, if you could articulate that we are drowning in data, but good Lord, there is data to actually help improve the climate, probably will take us a long way.
Yeah, I think going to your point, there is a lot of data, and I think there's also a lot of disparate regulatory situations going on. There's not one, even though Scope 3 is around, but we have a lot of regionalized governmental regulations. We need to find sort of some international methodology to implement regulations across all geographies, right? So yes, I think building transparency, utilizing the data that we have to be able to get that visibility and therefore report on something tangible is one of the keys to operationalizing it. But I think it's a cultural thing. So I'll give you briefly an example. When I was working in the 90s in this winery in Chile, so you're talking about 90s, Chile, rural area, and there was a guy sweeping inside one of those big cement vats of wine, right? It was emptied and there was lots of, anyway, so he was smoking in there. And I remember the American company I was representing, the winemaker was just could not fathom that someone was smoking in there when there were posters everywhere on quality control and ISO and all that stuff. And I just looked at her and I said, you do realize that guy doesn't know how to read. And I said, you're focused on all these brilliant posters, but no one's explained to him what the consequences are of why he shouldn't, why he shouldn't do that. So I think that there's a lot of management gloss that we place over sustainability initiatives without getting to the heart of the people on the ground to understand why. I hope that answers your question.
On that, smart ring center and collect probably will become the
Yes.
de facto standard in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
There's no excuse. People can just download their models and start measuring today.
There you go.
They can become better over time with the data. Thanks.
Oh,
Okay. Sorry.
okay.
You are talking about unlearning things. Yeah, that's very critical stuff in life now.
Yes.
So basically, we are in a strategic project. How can we convince our different stakeholders and business people to unlearn the old things or techniques they use and then learn the new changes? How it will be easy or difficult?
It's going to be hard.
Life?
Yeah. It's not going to be easy, but I think is to show examples of where that has worked. Look at, there are plenty of examples of leaders that have taken challenges on, taken risks, unlearned certain standard behaviors. I mean, we haven't modernized without changing the norm. Discoveries weren't made through doing the same thing. What is that quote about if they've wanted a faster horse, then Ford would have created a faster horse, not a car, right?
Yeah.
So the reality is you have to explore the people that are actually, I'm looking this way because my microphone doesn't pick me up there we go. So it's, you have to really point to the people that are succeeding at that. And there are people succeeding, and challenge decision makers to let them know that, look, the successful decision makers are the ones that are questioning to some degree some of the things that they know and willing to listen and learn from others.
I think if you read the book as well, it's in your pack from Newt and Radu, you'll probably get a load of examples there as well. I know there's some good information. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to have to call a halt now. I know that one of your mottos, Maria, was, never settle for good enough. Well, I don't think you settled for good enough. I think you did great, and I want to thank you for the illuminating conversation that we've had here. So please, a round of applause for Maria.
Thank you.